Our first reading from the book of Deuteronomy is a powerful reminder to us, as it was a reminder to ancient Israelites through the mouths of Moses, God's servant, that the commandments and statutes of God are not simply some code of principles outside or removed from us. They are given to us. As Moses said, they're in your heart. What it means for human beings to know what is good and right and true, it is within us, the deepest part of what we call our nature as human beings. Moses says, this is not something far and high above you. It's not rocket science, so to speak. With great respect to any rocket scientists who may be here in the congregation this morning, I affirm the sophistication of your work. It's not rocket science what it means to acknowledge one's responsibility to God and to one's neighbor. And what it means to offend these commands and statutes of God and neighbor is within the human heart, recognizing that we're in touch with a God-given truth. We prefer instead something else. Something dark, something hurtful, something that meets our own need at the expense of the needs and dignity of others. A few days ago, I had the opportunity to see a very well-done theatrical production. I don't know if you're familiar with this little service called Fathom Events. Well, Fathom Events is a service where theatrical productions from different stages around the world are simulcast in movie theaters. So you can go to the movie theater and see an opera production from the Metropolitan Opera in New York or from somewhere in London. And a couple days ago, I had the opportunity to see a London production of one of William Shakespeare's most famous plays, Romeo and Juliet. Now, we're all familiar, even if it goes back to high school, the last time we heard any verses of Romeo and Juliet, we're very familiar with the basic story, and some of the lines even we can quote, Romeo, Romeo, wherefore art thou, Rome, all of that. And we can have a sense of what that play is about, sort of sentimental, that misses a very powerful message at the heart of that play. The play is about two families, the Montagues and the Capulets. Two families so bent and twisted upon their enmity for one another that it costs them the next generation of their families. Romeo dies, Juliet dies, Tybalt dies, Mercutio dies. The entire next generation in two families wiped out because these people forgot a truth that was inscribed on their hearts and preferred instead their own hatred of one another. It struck me as very powerful in the play, the death of Mercutio, who was a friend of Romeo's, and he gets swept up in this enmity and finds himself in a duel in which he's kind of inadvertently stabbed and suffers a mortal wound. And he cries out famously and in frustration, "A plague upon both your houses," as he laments his circumstance. I've become wrapped up in this anger and hatred between these two families, and it's going to cost me my life. A plague on both your houses. Our first reading is paired with Jesus' most famous story from all the New Testament. And there are so many beautiful parables that Jesus tells. A scholar of the law hears the parable of the Good Samaritan. You know, it was just a couple weeks ago that we heard in the Gospel of Luke that Jesus was looking for hospitality in Samaritan territory, and they refused him. And he had to circumvent Samaria because they wouldn't welcome him. His disciples, James and John, asked Jesus if they could call down the wrath of God upon the Samaritans. And yet today, in response to the scholar's question, Jesus tells the parable of the Good Samaritan. Jesus is willing to see something in people that others refuse to see. Enmity between Jews and Samaritans was long-standing. And yet, to a scholar of the Mosaic Law, Jesus offers the example of a good Samaritan, precisely the kind of person that you don't think can be good or have any sense of the right and the true. This becomes the example to the scholar of the Mosaic Law. Go and do likewise, Jesus says. Now, there are basic moral principles that are fundamental to human nature. In the Gospels, Jesus quotes one of them himself. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Christianity did not invent that moral aphorism. Many religious and philosophical and wisdom traditions throughout history and around the globe had some expression of this. An expression of a basic moral stance that any human being can be in touch with because it's deeply woven into the fabric of human nature. Do good and avoid evil. In the Old Testament, the book of Tobit expresses it this way: and what you hate, do not do to anyone. Confucius taught it. It's in Hinduism. It's in Buddhism. It's in Islam. It's all over the world, a fundamental sense that human beings can be in touch with and aware of immutable laws whose source is beyond human nature and experience. In our second reading, we hear a beautiful song, a celebration of Christ and who he is. And I was very drawn to the verse that says, in him, in Christ, all things hold together. And if you're having the experience that I am having, living in our country in these times, you may find yourself struggling to think that all things are holding together. It can look like things are falling apart. Who and what is it that holds all things together? We as Christians have one answer to that: Jesus Christ. He is the image of the invisible God. All things, visible and invisible, exist through him. He is before all things, and in him all things hold together. This is a truth that we can perceive, woven into the fabric of our being to give shape to our relations with God and with the people who share the world with us, even if they be our enemies. What does it mean to express a preference for our deepest truth in challenging times in which we can be bent toward bitterness, anger, and resentfulness toward people who Christ tells us in our hearts are human beings just as we are? May our celebration of this Eucharist, the nourishment of Christ's very presence, strengthen us to see in others what we believe Christ would see in us, and to say yes to the best angels of our nature.